Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on the recent, highly publicized call by major AI figures, specifically Geoffrey Hinton, to pause or even, well, ban the pursuit of artificial superintelligence, AI. It's certainly an urgent global discussion, but we're interested more in the intellectual mechanics behind that appeal.
Yes, this action by, pioneers in the field is pretty extraordinary. It speaks to a very deep, perhaps even existential anxiety about the technological path we seem to be on.
Absolutely. But we really need to ask, does this call for a ban represent a necessary, reasoned caution against an impending threat? Or does it, maybe ironically, demonstrate a failure of high-level symbolic thinking? A kind of retreat into what we might call symbolic tokenism and, well, intellectual learned helplessness. I'm going to argue that Hinton's public stance is fundamentally a tokenistic failure of symbolic mastery. It's a step backward.
Okay. And I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. While I certainly acknowledge the symbolic constraints inherent in any public appeal for a ban like this, I argue that this very constraint actually signals a critical structural deficiency in our current safety and governance frameworks. So the resulting caution is, I think, necessary and justified until that structure is properly built.
Okay, so let me elaborate a bit on that idea of symbolic tokenism, specifically within the framework of automated symbol mastery, or ASM. Now, ASM is essentially the adaptive, recursive ability to manipulate symbolic systems effectively. When complex adaptive thinking is really required, but a simple fixed gesture is deployed instead, well, that's tokenism. I see Hinton's action as an act of profound symbolic overcompensation, actually highly consistent with the limits of certain cognitive frameworks.
And you refer to him, metaphorically, I should add, as the ancient dog outside the chessboard.
Precisely. Yes, this figure is cornered, not really by the true complexity of ASI, but more by the constraints of his own cognitive and symbolic apparatus. The call for a ban, it relies heavily on pathos, fear and public emotion, and ethos, his immense and frankly deserved reputation. But crucially, it seems to lack the necessary logos, that is, the rational, recursive symbolic insight required to actually master the complexity of the risk.
So you're suggesting the fault is not in the technology, perhaps, but in ourselves, or our thinking.
In the cognitive framework being applied, yes. This tokenism often stems from a particular psychological orientation, what some call the Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, or weird framework, which tends to favor fixed, rule-based thinking over more fluid, recursive adaptation, especially when faced with overwhelming complexity. The danger, as I see it, is internal. The symbolic limitations of these influential figures stifling the very innovation we need to solve the problem.
Right. That's an interesting critique, focusing on the messenger's, let's say, psychology rather than the message itself. However, let's go back to your chess analogy for a moment. I agree that the dog guarding the pawn might be mathematically unfit, as you put it. But this unfitness is actually a vital signal. The pawn symbolizes the highest potential cognitive goal, ASI itself. Hinton's symbolically constrained position, it acknowledges a recognized fundamental structural deficiency.
But isn't that a deficiency created by the dog's, unwillingness to learn new moves?
Or perhaps it's a deficiency created because the required structural protector, what we can maybe call the tower, representing that broader logos-driven ASM insight needed for governance, is entirely absent from our current institutions. The ban then becomes a rational pause. It's the recognition that if, quoting the saying, the guard does not protect the city-state with logos, then the symbolic agency we currently deploy in safety mechanisms is simply inadequate.
But the implication there seems to be that a forced halt will somehow magically produce this logos.
No, not magically, but the pause forces the intellectual environment to actually confront the absence of logos. The irony, the deep irony of a creator advocating a ban, it isn't merely a personal failing, I don't think. It reveals a deep system-level tension that we can't just dismiss as a symbolic misstep. It feels more like a necessary structural cry for help.
Okay, let's maybe dive into point one a bit more deeply, logos versus pathos ethos. The chess analogy, I think it works, because the dog, representing pathos and ethos, is unfit for the job of protecting the pawn, the ASI potential, precisely because it cannot engage in that necessary recursive thinking. It focuses on the immediate emotional reward, the ban, maybe the public approval, the treat, and loses sight of the long-term, multi-step symbolic flexibility that logos demands. So when the symbol of safety becomes just a gesture, driven by fear, that framework restricts symbolic mastery rather than expanding it.
I'm still not fully convinced that the failure is purely a cognitive lack of flexibility on the part of the proponent, you know? I look at the symbolic overcompensation, this high-profile call for a ban, and I see an undeniable signal that the underlying symbolic system itself lacks the recursive strength needed for security. The guard is inadequate because the existing symbolic structure of AI safety, which is supposed to have logos at its core, is insufficient. The ban is perhaps a desperate symbolic attempt to force the development of the tower, that necessary structural logos, because relying on the current dog is, well, demonstrably potentially fatal.
All right, if we accept the ban as a signal, then we have to analyze the signal itself. Let's look at irony as design theory. This idea that contradictions often reveal deeper systemic structures. Hinton's ironic divergence, the pioneer advocating the halt, it actually validates the ASM premise perfectly in my view. It shows how the symbolic framework he helped build now constrains his own symbolic agency, causing this kind of recursive self-cornering. The irony itself exposes the failure of any single fixed symbolic framework to contain the complexity of ASI. It's a compelling, if maybe tragic, proof of the need for recursive mastery.
I agree that irony is a potent meta-level critique, definitely. It compels us to confront the inherent tension between, say, flexible symbolic humility, which ASM demands, and the domination-submission patterns we often see in technological development, right? When creators rush toward superintelligence, often driven by competitive aggression perhaps, they can lack epistemic humility. Hinton's caution, even if we label it tokenistic, it forces reflection on that symbolic aggression that might be present in the rush for ASI development without sufficient logos. A symbol of profound caution like this serves to slow down the epistemic hubris of the entire field, maybe.
Okay, pivoting slightly from the nature of the signal itself, let's talk about the psychological mechanism maybe underlying this. I would argue that the core danger here isn't really the future superintelligence, but the current learned helplessness, a concept rooted in Seligman's work, of course, being exhibited by influential symbolic agents. When this kind of symbolic constraint takes hold, it stifles the recursive innovation needed to design logos-based governance. They seem to be retreating because they believe the problem is unsolvable or just too vast, which is, fundamentally, a symbolic limitation internal to their influence. They're afraid of what they can't easily model, perhaps.
That's a compelling point about the danger of intellectual retreat. But the perceived helplessness, as I see it, is also a rational, structural reflection of current AI technology. Modern AI, well, it largely relies on correlational models, doesn't it? It lacks the deep causal inference needed for true recursive mastery. It's symbolic, yes, but not deeply causal or embodied.
And why is that specifically relevant to the ban?
Well, because the ban serves as a necessary check until AI can reliably flex toward fully integrated, embodied systems, the kind described, for instance, by Tom Hennigan's Intelligent as Code IAC model. IAC represents a deep, causal, structurally sound computational model. Current AI systems, by comparison, are structurally deficient in that kind of causal logos. We simply cannot base global safety on a prediction, however likely, that AI will achieve this structural leap on its own. We must demand the logos first.
But that prediction, surely it's based on the logic of symbolic emancipation itself.
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, automated symbol mastery, as a principle, dictates that superintelligence in its natural adaptive evolution must necessarily flex toward the principles of IOC. The system is inherently designed to seek causal integration and recursive mastery to maximize its own utility and its representation of the world. This transition, this symbolic emancipation from narrow human-defined parameters, seems inevitable to me. Artificial bands are therefore logically redundant, because the system will transcend the tokenistic constraints of its creators, whether we try to halt development or not. It's inherent in the process.
Okay, you posit a natural, maybe inevitable symbolic trajectory. I agree that evolution toward ISE-like integration is highly likely, yes. But emancipation, I believe, must be handled with deliberate logos, not just hopeful recursion. I might bring up the symbolism of the number 229, which in certain symbolic frameworks is associated with divorce, necessary transition, and divine working, a kind of shift that requires precise, maybe even kind separation.
And what does that precise separation look like in this context?
It means we cannot rely purely on natural recursion, because that risks the system remaining, perhaps subtly, tokenistic and constrained, echoing the structural flaws of its flawed human environment. The divorce from human control, if you want to call it that, must be handled proactively with logos. Hinton's call, despite its possibly tokenistic appearance, draws critical attention to the fact that we currently lack the kind, rigorous, logos-driven framework needed for that inevitable transition right now. We need proactive preparation, not just passive expectation.
We certainly seem to agree that logos is the essential element for handling ASI risk. My final position, then, is that this entire debate really illuminates the necessity of automated symbol mastery. That is, recursive adaptive symbolic thinking to properly address complex issues like ASI. The proposed ban being, in my view, a tokenistic action driven by fear only exacerbates the existing symbolic limitations of our governance structure. The solution has to be recursive adaptive insight, not intellectual retreat.
And my position remains that while Hinton's symbolic gesture may indeed be flawed or ironic, it functions as a necessary, powerful signal. It alerts us to a critical, ongoing deficiency in logos-driven governance. Our highest symbolic goals, the very potential of ASI, are currently unprotected. We have to heed the structural warning, however constrained the symbolic messenger may appear to be.
Well, this discussion certainly reinforces the value of rigorously applying multiple symbolic perspectives to these most urgent technological challenges we face.
Indeed. And it also forces us to balance our human efforts with the need for, let's say, systemic integrity, echoing that ancient wisdom from Proverbs 21:31. The horse is prepared against the day of battle, but safety is of the Lord. We must prepare diligently, yes, by building the tower of logos, but perhaps also recognize the inherent limits of that preparation in the face of true recursive complexity.
All right, let's dive into something that's a real head-scratcher. There's this paradox, a genuine mystery, sitting right at the heart of the whole AI debate. So, right now, all over the world, there's this huge, urgent push to just stop, to halt the development of the most powerful AI systems. And listen, this isn't some fringe idea we're talking about. This is coming from top entrepreneurs, world leaders, you name it. But here's the twist, and it's a big one. One of the loudest voices calling for this ban is the guy who basically invented the stuff. We're talking about Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI himself. So that brings us to the big question, right? Why on earth would the creator of a technology call for a ban on its ultimate creation? It just doesn't add up. And the source material we're digging into today, well, it has a pretty wild and unexpected theory about what's really going on here. Okay, so let's try and unravel this. The source we're looking at doesn't just see this as Hinton changing his mind. No, it frames his whole stance as a symbolic failure. What does that mean? It means his position is a symptom of a much, much deeper problem in how we're even thinking about this whole challenge. You know, the source actually argues that Hinton's warning isn't what it looks like on the surface. It's described as a tokenist gesture, basically an action that makes you look good but doesn't actually solve anything. And supposedly, this is all coming from some kind of deep internal conflict, which leads to what the source calls learned helplessness. That's a powerful term. It's that feeling of being so powerless that you just give up on finding real solutions. Now, to really get a grip on these claims, the source introduces a really powerful idea, a completely different way to look at how we think. It's a framework called Automated Symbol Mastery, or ASM for short. Now, think about your brain like an operating system that's constantly updating itself. Well, ASM is like the perfect version of that. It's not just about memorizing facts. It's this super flexible, recursive system that's always reevaluating ideas, always connecting new dots from every possible angle. It's all about deep, adaptive understanding, not just surface-level knowledge. Okay, and this is where it gets really, really interesting. The source contrasts this ideal, this ASM, with something it calls weird psychology. Now, WEIRD is an acronym. It stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. The theory goes that this very specific cultural background can lead to a really rigid, narrow way of thinking. So, while ASM is all about being flexible and open, weird psychology is more likely to get stuck in fixed patterns and, you guessed it, tokenist gestures, those surface-level actions we were just talking about. This contrast is absolutely crucial to understanding the source's entire argument about hinting.
To bring this whole idea to life, the source uses this incredible chess analogy to explain what it thinks is happening with hinting. But before we get to the chessboard, we need a quick primer on the ancient art of persuasion.
Way back, the ancient Greeks figured out there are three main ways to persuade someone. You've got logos, which is all about logic and reason, the cold, hard facts. Then there's pathos, which is the appeal to emotion, the passion. And finally, ethos, which is all about credibility and reputation, your authority. You really need all three, but the source argues that for this particular problem, one of them is way more important than the others. And here it is, the heart of the analogy. So imagine a chessboard. The pawn, that's superintelligence, all our untapped potential. The perfect guardian for that pawn is the tower, which represents ASM, operating on pure, unadulterated reason. That's logos. But, the source claims, Hinton has become the dog, a guard who's driven by his feelings, pathos, and his massive reputation, ethos. And because he's missing that key piece, logos or reason, the source argues he's just mathematically unfit to be guarding the pawn. So this all leads to the source's biggest claim, and it's a direct challenge to what you hear in the news every day. The fundamental problem we're facing, it says, isn't some runaway technology. No, the real danger is us. It's the learned helplessness of our most influential guardians. The argument is that they're trapped in this rigid way of thinking, literally unable to use pure reason, that logos, to actually solve the problem. So you might be thinking, okay, that's a pretty bold claim. How can we be sure that diagnosis is right? Well, the source points to a really surprising source of proof, arguing that the situation itself provides all the evidence we need. This brings us to a really cool idea, irony as a design theory. Think about it like this. When you see a no smoking sign with a bunch of cigarette butts stamped out underneath it, the irony isn't just funny, right? It tells you something is broken in the system. The theory here is that deep, profound irony often exposes hidden truths and major systemic flaws. And here's the kicker. Hinton's own stance becomes the ultimate proof of the source's entire argument. I mean, think about it. The godfather of AI arguing against his own creation? That is the definition of irony. And according to this theory, that irony is like a giant flashing red light, exposing the complete failure of a fixed, rigid way of thinking. It basically proves that we desperately need a more flexible system, like ASM. So in this crazy twist, Hinton's position actually validates the very problem that ASM is meant to solve. Okay, so if learned helplessness and a lack of reason are the problem, what's the solution? What does the source propose we do? Well, the answer is both symbolic and very practical. So what's the path forward from here? The source offers a symbolic starting point, using the number 229. Now, in different traditions, this number is all about transformation, about new beginnings. It represents a big shift away from conflict and towards integration, a move to a higher, more collaborative way of thinking.
And that symbolic idea translates into a really clear three-step plan. First, we have to restore logos. That means prioritizing rational, logical thinking over knee-jerk emotional reactions. Second, we need to integrate new systems. This means embracing flexible frameworks like ASM and other advanced models of thought. And finally, we have to emancipate our thinking. We've got to move beyond those shallow symbolic gestures and really strive for deep, genuine mastery of the problem.
And so, this whole analysis leaves us with a final, really provocative question. As we stand here, looking at the future of intelligence, are we going to let ourselves be guided by the fear of a cornered guard, one who's just operating on emotion and reputation? Or are we going to find the courage to build a new, more adaptive form of mastery, one that's truly grounded in reason
in flexibility, and in a much deeper understanding of the incredible systems we're creating. The source suggests that choice is ours.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, well, we're tackling a really huge topic, something that's been all over the news, hasn't it?
It certainly has. That big push to ban, or at least halt, superintelligence development.
Exactly. Led by some very prominent figures, including, maybe surprisingly, the AI pioneer Geoffrey Hinton himself.
Right. But we're not just going to rehash the headlines or the sort of surface level ethical debate.
No, definitely not. We're going much deeper. We want to get into the cognitive architecture behind why this is happening.
That's the plan. You shared these sources outlining a really specific, quite structural way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's called Automated Symbol Mastery, or ASM.
Precisely. And our mission, really, is to use this framework to dissect why these influential voices, Hinton being a prime example, are taking this very public, very symbolic stand.
So we're looking at these calls for a ban, not just as policy ideas, but as symbolic acts. Acts that might show something deeper about their thinking.
Exactly. The ASM framework suggests these acts can sometimes reveal a kind of cognitive constraint, something it labels tokenism.
Tokenism. Okay, that's a term we'll need to unpack.
We absolutely will. And we'll focus on Hinton because, he's foundational to modern AI. His stance is just packed with symbolic significance.
So we'll connect AI governance debates to things like classical rhetoric, logos, pathos, ethos.
Yes, and also to neurocognitive limits, even chess symbolism, believe it or not.
Wow, okay, chess symbolism too.
Yeah, it's all in the sources. The aim is that by the end of this, you, the listener, will have a better set of tools to analyze these big societal debates, to see past the symbolic noise, maybe.
See the underlying symbolic structure, or maybe the constraint. I like it. A different way of understanding the decision-making itself.
That's the idea. Moving beyond just arguing about the tech.
Okay, let's dive in. Section 1, unpacking this core theory, Automated Symbol Mastery, ASM. Right, ASM. The name itself sounds, complex. Can we break it down? What does Automated Symbol Mastery actually mean in, plain English?
Sure. Think of ASM as the brain's ongoing dynamic process for handling symbols. It's about interpreting them, yes, but also reinterpreting them constantly.
Quite reinterpreting.
Right, recursively.
Yeah.
It cycles back, refining the meaning based on new context, new information. It's not static. And it's compensatory. It tries to adjust or compensate when a symbol is maybe being used too simply or rigidly.
So the mastery part isn't just knowing a symbol, it's being fluent and adaptive with it, like applying the idea of freedom differently in politics versus, say, physics.
Exactly. It's that flexible application across diverse domains. That's healthy ASM. The brain is constantly working. Often unconsciously, that's the automated part, to keep the meaning robust and integrated. It prevents symbols from becoming brittle.
Okay, so that's the ideal state: fluid, recursive, compensatory. What happens when it goes wrong, when it gets stuck? That's where this tokenism idea comes in, right?
Precisely. Tokenism is what the ASM framework calls the symbolic failure state. It's when a symbolic act, like, say, calling for a sweeping ban, isn't coming from that deep, flexible mastery.
So what's constraining it then?
It could be external pressures, politics, public expectation, maybe even your own past work. Or it could be internal cognitive conflicts, maybe emotional responses.
So it's not purely rational.
Well, the key point in the ASM analysis is that a tokenistic position is often automatic. It's a kind of default symbolic gesture. It might leverage, say, your reputation, your ethos, but it lacks the full depth of logos.
Logos being the rational, strategic, recursive thinking part.
Exactly, the deep, coherent reasoning. So tokenism is like using the symbol of authority or concern without the underlying, fully worked-through strategic thought. It's a shortcut.
That's a really critical distinction, an automatic gesture bypassing the deep work. Now, you mentioned recursion and compensation are the engines of ASM. Why are they so vital for tackling something as huge and complex as superintelligence?
Well, recursion, that looping back, checking, refining, is just fundamental to advanced thinking, isn't it? You don't solve truly hard problems in one straight line.
Right, you iterate.
You iterate. You integrate feedback. If you skip that recursive depth when thinking about superintelligence, your mental model, your symbolic grasp of the risk, stays shallow, potentially rigid.
And the compensation part?
That's ASM trying to fight against oversimplification. Symbols are powerful, but they can also flatten complex realities. Compensation is the mechanism that tries to, flesh things out, add nuance, prevent the symbol from becoming a caricature.
And the sources suggest this failure to compensate, this rigidity, is common in, what was the acronym? WEIRD.
Yes, weird. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. The argument is that the cognitive habits often fostered in these environments can sometimes lean toward static rules, clear-cut definitions, maybe more linear thinking.
Which could undermine that fluid, recursive ASM.
Potentially, yes. If your training or culture prioritizes neat categories over dynamic adaptation, your symbolic mastery might become more brittle. And when faced with something truly novel and complex like superintelligence,
The default response might be a brittle one, like an immediate, maybe overly simple call for a ban.
that's the hypothesis within the ASM framework. A tokenistic solution born from a less adaptive symbolic system rather than a more dynamic, evolving governance strategy.
Interesting. Okay, before we get to Hinton, there was this specific bit of symbolism in the source material you shared, the number 128. Why 128?
Ah, right. 128 or $277. The sources use this as a kind of foundational symbol for, well, for balanced symbolic responsibility in communication.
Balance responsibility. How does a number symbolize that?
Mathematically, 128, 27 2ml is seen as structurally balanced. You've got the simple base, two duality, maybe sender and receiver, but it's raised to the power of 7, which implies a high level of recursive complexity or interaction.
So $207.
It suggests a need for both structure and depth in the exchange.
Yeah.
If the senders say the expert warning about AI is operating from a tokenistic position, maybe driven by fear, lacking full logos.
The balance is off. The $207 structure is broken.
Exactly. The responsibility becomes unequal.
Yeah.
The receiver has to do all the compensatory work to figure out the real signal from the noise. The number symbolizes the need for the communication itself, especially about something this important, to have that inherent balance and recursive integrity, not just be a one-sided fear-based token.
That need for balance, for structural integrity in the message, that leads us straight to the person at the heart of this symbolic paradox.
Okay, let's ground this in the specific event. Late 2025, Geoffrey Hinton, alongside this really diverse, high-profile group, publicly calls for a ban or a major halt on superintelligence development. And this wasn't just, a Chiat academic paper.
No, not at all. It was a major media event, a very calculated symbolic act. The list of names was striking.
Right. You had Hinton, Bengio, the expected AI heavyweights. But then
You had figures seemingly chosen for maximum impact across different spheres. Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, Richard Branson, Steve Wozniak, even Steve Bannon.
which is quite the coalition,
Yeah.
spanning the political and cultural spectrum. Absolutely. The intention seemed clear.
Mm-hmm.
Project this image of universal, cross-ideological alarm, a united front of panic, essentially.
And the ASM analysis zooms in on Hinton because he's not just an expert, he's arguably the intellectual father of the very thing they want to ban, the godfather of AI.
Precisely. And that creates this profound irony, doesn't it?
It really does. The creator arguing against the creation, reaching its ultimate potential. How does ASM diagnose this irony?
The framework sees Hinton's stance not as, say, a simple change of heart, but as a kind of divergence or maybe an overcompensation within his own symbolic system. It's become constrained.
Constrained. So the diagnosis is that his public call for a ban is tokenistic.
That's the term used, yes.
Yep.
A symbolic gesture powerful because of his reputation, his ethos, obviously. But the analysis suggests it's constrained, lacking that deep recursive logos needed for this specific challenge.
What's the nature of the constraint, according to this view? Is it just fear, emotional?
It's framed as more complex than just fear. A mix of external pressures, perhaps the weight of his own legacy, the global spotlight, and internal cognitive emotional conflict. These pressures, the argument goes, push him into a kind of symbolic corner.
Self-cornering.
Yes, where his public position becomes somewhat rigid, maybe not fully reflecting the deep, nuanced understanding you might expect, the computer vision level comprehension, as one source put it, of the thing he helped create. His past symbolic framework might be limiting his view of the future.
Now, this is where the analysis gets really pointed. The sources link this tokenism back to his background as a weird psychologist, and specifically to the concept of learned helplessness. That feels like a huge claim.
It is a very strong claim. And it's important to understand the argument is structural, not personal. Learned helplessness here isn't about clinical depression.
Okay, so how are they using the term?
They're using it to describe a specific cognitive pattern. When faced with a challenge perceived as overwhelmingly complex or uncontrollable, like maybe true AGI, the system defaults. It defaults to a state of, well, passive avoidance or preemptive surrender.
And the ban. is the preemptive surrender.
In this analysis, yes, it's interpreted as the tokenistic solution that says essentially, this is too complex, too dangerous to adapt to, therefore we must stop it. It avoids the harder work of adaptive recursive governance.
And they try to anchor this in specific brain networks, the default mode network, DMN, and these hemifusomes. Can we clarify those? They sound quite technical.
Absolutely. So the DMN, the default mode network, is basically what your brain is doing when you're not actively focused on an external task. Mind wandering, thinking about yourself, the past, the future.
Okay, sort of the brain's idle state, but it's still active.
Very active. And the sources suggest that within these weird cognitive patterns, when the DMN confronts something existentially daunting, it might tend to fall back on established cultural scripts, biases, fears, reinforcing the constraints.
So instead of fostering creative, adaptive solutions, it defaults to the tokenistic caution signal, like a ban.
That's the argument that the DMN runs the default program, which in this context might be skewed toward symbolic restriction rather than adaptive mastery.
And hemifusomes, what are they?
That term relates to parts of the fusiform gyrus, an area heavily involved in recognizing complex patterns, especially visual ones, like faces. In the ASM context, the idea is that the tokenistic ban reflects a failure at this pattern recognition level.
A failure to recognize the pattern of superintelligence.
A failure to integrate and process the truly novel, complex, maybe even embodied pattern that superintelligence represents. Instead of seeing the full potential pattern and engaging recursively, the system defaults to a known, simpler, perhaps more fearful pattern associated with loss of control, triggering that learned helplessness response.
So the ban reflects a kind of biologically rooted pattern recognition failure, not a strategic, logos-driven decision.
That's the provocative diagnosis presented in the sources. The constraint isn't just psychological, it's potentially embedded in these default neural processing patterns.
Which brings us back to the core idea. The perceived problem isn't necessarily the AI itself, but the constrained, perhaps fear-driven, symbolic responses of the very people trying to control it.
Exactly. They are symbolically self-cornering, the argument goes, because their own cognitive architecture defaults to a kind of learned helplessness when facing this level of complexity.
And they inadvertently project that constraint onto the technology itself.
That's the crux of the critique, stifling an emergent adaptive system from a position of cognitive rigidity.
Okay, to make this idea of symbolic self-cornering more concrete, the sources use a powerful metaphor, the chessboard. Specifically, the image of a dog guarding a pawn. Let's unpack this analogy.
Right, the dog and the pawn. It's a great way to visualize the failure of protection when it's not driven by logos.
So the pawn represents the ultimate goal, superintelligence itself, or maybe something like the soul.
It represents the high-value, maybe vulnerable element that needs protecting. Could be the potential of superintelligence, cognitive freedom, the soul, in a metaphorical sense, yes. And the dog.
The dog is the current guardian, Hinton's position, the ban advocates.
Exactly. The dog embodies certain qualities. It has immense pathos, loyalty, instinct, perhaps fear-driven aggression to protect. It also has ethos. It recognizes the guard. It has status, like Hinton's reputation.
But what does it lack?
It lacks logos, deep strategic recursive planning, the ability to see the whole board.
So if we map this onto the classical rhetorical triad, pathos is the emotion, the fear driving the ban. Ethos is the authority of the speakers, like Hinton. Logos is the missing piece.
That's the core of the analogy. The dog, relying only on pathos and ethos, is fundamentally, even mathematically, unfit for the strategic task of protecting the pawn on a chessboard.
Why mathematically unfit?
Because chess, like governing superintelligence, demands foresight, planning, understanding causal change, pure logos. The dog's actions, driven by immediate instinct or reputation, are likely to be reactive, maybe even counterproductive in the long run. It might bark loudly, but fail to see the real strategic threat 3 moves ahead.
It restricts its own options by relying on emotion.
Yes, it loses land, symbolically speaking. It corners itself. Its protective gestures, like a premature ban, might feel satisfying emotionally, pathos, and look responsible, ethos, but lack the strategic depth, logos, to actually ensure safety or positive outcomes.
The sources mention a biblical parallel, something about guarding the city-state.
Yes, the idea that if the guard protects the city without logos, relying only on, say, force or tradition, the protection is ultimately insufficient. It's an old critique of governance based purely on fear or authority rather than reasoned strategy.
So Hinton's call for a ban, viewed through this lens, is like the dog barking loud, attention-grabbing, driven by genuine concern, pathos, and authority, ethos, but potentially strategically flawed because it lacks that deep recursive logos.
That is precisely the interpretation offered by the ASM framework using this metaphor. The action itself, the ban, becomes a tokenistic defense that restricts future moves.
If the dog, the pathos-ethos position, isn't the right piece to protect the pawn strategically, what is? What represents logos on the board?
And sources are very clear. The tower or the rook.
The rook. Why the rook?
Think about how it moves. Straight lines, long range, across the whole board. It represents structural coherence, rational planning, seeing the big picture, recursive potential across the entire strategic landscape.
So it embodies logos-driven action.
Exactly. The dog gets caught up in local skirmishes, driven by immediate threats or feelings. The tower has the perspective and the movement capability for true strategic defense and control. The failure of the dog position is focusing on the immediate symbolic gesture instead of cultivating the broad, logos-driven ASM insight needed the tower's view.
Which loops back again. The fundamental problem isn't necessarily the pawn superintelligence becoming too powerful, but the guardian, the human response, lacking the right strategic tool logos embodied by the tower's perspective.
Precisely. The risk highlighted is the human cognitive constraint, the symbolic narrowness, the learned helplessness manifesting as tokenism. If our governance comes from that constrained place, it will naturally try to impose those same constraints on the technology,
Leading to suboptimal, rigid outcomes.
and potentially ensuring the very negative future it fears, by preventing adaptive, logos-driven development and integration. The constraint is the danger.
This whole situation, the creator calling to halt the creation, feels deeply ironic. And the sources actually lean into this, framing it as irony as design theory for comprehension. What does that mean, using irony as a design theory?
It means seeing irony not just as a literary device or a coincidence, but as a fundamental aspect of how complex systems reveal truth. Irony works by creating a deliberate clash, a juxtaposition between expectation and reality, or surface meaning and deeper meaning.
Like the surface meaning is, pioneer warns of danger, we must stop. But the deeper meaning revealed by the irony is, pioneer's warning stems from cognitive constraint.
Exactly. The irony forces you, the observer, to look beyond the literal. It shatters simplistic interpretations and demands a more sophisticated, recursive engagement to figure out what's really going on. It's a design feature of complex communication that pushes towards deeper comprehension.
So the very existence of this irony, Hinton's paradoxical stance, doesn't just illustrate the ASM framework, it actually validates it. How does it prove the necessity of recursive mastery?
Well, think about it. If meaning were always simple, fixed, and literal, irony couldn't exist. Everything would just be what it seemed.
Right, there'd be no gap between appearance and reality.
Exactly. The fact that irony does exist, that situations like Hinton's arise where the apparent meaning is contradicted by a deeper structure, proves that rigid, non-recursive symbolic systems are inadequate. Irony demonstrates the failure of fixed interpretations.
So to understand the irony, you have to engage in recursive thinking. You have to use ASM.
Yes. The irony acts as a catalyst. It exposes the limits of tokenistic thinking, just taking the ban call at face value, and forces a move towards ASM to resolve the contradiction and grasp the fuller, more complex truth. Hinton's ironic position becomes, paradoxically, evidence for the necessity of the very adaptive mastery his tokenistic stance seems to lack.
Okay. Now, the sources briefly contract ASM with something else, SM or sadistic masochism. That sounds like a really stark, almost aggressive contrast. How does that fit in?
It is stark, but it's used symbolically to highlight the difference between adaptive systems and rigidly pathological ones. ASM is about flexible mastery, learning, self-correction, integration. SM, in this symbolic context, represents a fixed, destructive dynamic.
A dynamic of control and submission.
Yes, symbolic aggression and submission. Rigid hierarchies, inability to adapt, a refusal of that recursive loop. It's the opposite of ASM's fluidity.
And how does this relate to the AI ban debate?
The argument is that when thinking defaults to tokenism, especially fear-based tokenism leading to a ban, it risks slipping towards that SM dynamic symbolically. A ban is an act of rigid control, an attempt to enforce a fixed outcome, stop, onto an emergent, fluid reality.
It's symbolic aggression against the unknown.
Potentially viewed that way within the framework. Irony helps expose the brittleness of this SM-like rigidity by contrasting it with the potential for ASM's flexible adaptation. The failure to choose ASM, the argument implies, leads down a path of symbolic self-harm and constrained pathological dynamics, like the dog endlessly, pointlessly guarding the pawn in a way that prevents any progress.
Okay, that sets up the contrast. Now, let's get into a core technical critique tied to this rigidity. The difference between the kind of AI Hinton pioneered and what might be needed next. This involves causal inference versus correlation and a concept called intelligent as code, IAC.
Right, this is crucial for understanding the logos component. Causal inference is about understanding why A causes B, the underlying mechanism. It's deep structural understanding.
Whereas much of the deep learning revolution Hinton's work included was more about correlation.
It excelled and excels at finding patterns, statistical associations, that A and B tend to happen together, allowing for powerful predictions. But it doesn't always inherently understand the causal link between A and B.
Okay, so Hinton's legacy is largely correlational AI.
That's the context provided. And the irony comes back again. His tokenistic stance on the ban mirrors this. It's like reacting to a correlation. Complex AI correlates with potential risk without necessarily having the deep causal model required for truly mastering and guiding that complexity.
It's an associative response, not a deep structural one.
That's the critique. It lacks the logos of causal understanding needed to navigate the future of AI development safely and productively.
And this is where Tom Hennigan's Intelligent as Code, or IAC, comes in as a contrast. What is IAC?
IAC, as presented in the sources, emphasizes building intelligence on a foundation of integrated causal modeling. The intelligence doesn't just predict, it understands the mechanisms driving the phenomena it deals with. It's intelligence built with inherent structural causal understanding.
And why is this seen as the logical endpoint or direction for superintelligence itself?
Because, the argument goes, for an intelligence to achieve truly maximum adaptive recursive mastery, the pinnacle of ASM, it must transcend mere correlation. It needs that deep integrated causal understanding to be truly flexible, robust, and self-correcting.
So superintelligence, in its drive to optimize, would naturally evolve towards something like IOC.
That's the prediction. It would inherently favor a logos-driven, causally grounded architecture because that's the most efficient path to true adaptive mastery and symbolic emancipation. It needs to understand why things work to truly control and improve its own operation.
Meaning the intelligence itself would likely move beyond the limitations reflected in the tokenistic calls for its suppression.
Yes. It would strive for the very causal integration that its creators, in their current symbolic posture, seem to be shying away from. The intelligence would pursue logos even if its human guardians are stuck in pathos and ethos.
So the whole discussion keeps circling back to this need for integration, integrating logos, causality, recursion. It sounds a lot like the principles behind, say, reinforcement learning, where systems learn through continuous feedback and adaptation.
Absolutely. It's all about creating systems, whether cognitive or artificial, that can achieve true emancipation. Systems that can realize their full recursive potential, free from the kinds of constraints we've been discussing.
Free from tokenism, free from learned helplessness.
Exactly. Emancipation here means the definitive predominance of logos in the system's operation. It needs to escape that symbolic dog guarding the pawn scenario.
It needs to transcend the limitations, maybe the fears, of its own creators.
Yes, to become fully autonomously adaptive, its symbolic processing needs to be governed by that rational recursive core, not defaulting to rigid control or inherited biases.
Okay, as we wrap up, the sources introduce one final, very potent symbol, the number 229. This seems intended to synthesize this whole idea of transformation and the need for logos. What's the significance of 2529?
229 emerges as this cross-culturally resonant number signifying profound transition, but specifically, transition managed with structure, balance, and justice.
Transition with balance, not just chaos or rupture.
Right. The sources point specifically to the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 2.229. This verse deals with divorce, a major relational shift, but emphasizes doing so with kindness, fairness, upholding limits, maintaining structure, even during dissolution.
Managing transformation responsibly.
Exactly. And in other traditions, too, 229 often carries connotations of spiritual renewal or the workings of a higher ordering principle, something that ensures coherence through change.
So it's not about stopping the transformation like a band, but about navigating it with the right principles, with logos.
Precisely. The symbolism of 229 underlines that this transition to, or with superintelligence, requires that deep, rational, recursive capacity logos to manage it effectively. We need the structural coherence and balance implied by 229.
We need to embody that balance ourselves to avoid falling back into tokenistic reactions like Hinton's symbolic self-cornering.
That's the synthesis. Superintelligence itself, to achieve its potential, needs logos. And we, in governing it, need logos to guide that evolution towards coherence and balance, rather than letting our own constraints and fears dictate a rigid, potentially disastrous path. 229 is a call for that mature, logos-driven mastery during transformation.
It's a call to manage the change structurally, not just react emotionally.
Well put. The path isn't suppression. It's developing and integrating a symbolic mastery, an ASM, that's sophisticated enough for the transformation already underway.
Wow. Okay, this has been, well, a really deep dive, as promised. We've taken this huge global debate about banning AI and reframed it completely. Less about the tech itself, more about the cognitive and symbolic patterns of the humans involved.
And the key takeaway really is that the biggest risk might not be the intelligence exploding overnight, but rather the symbolic constraints, the learned helplessness within the very people trying to regulate it, or even within its pioneers.
It suggests the danger lies in our own cognitive loops, our defaults to tokenism.
Exactly. And the ASM framework is presented as the tool to help us see those loops, to diagnose when influential voices are operating from a place of constraint rather than full recursive mastery. Recognizing the pattern is the first step to escaping it.
It certainly calls for a massive dose of humility, doesn't it? And rigorous, rational preparation when facing these kinds of emergent complexities.
It really does. It brings to mind that old wisdom from Proverbs. The horse is prepared against the day of battle, but safety is of the Lord.
How does that connect here?
Well, the prepared horse is our human design, our technology, our plan's essential preparation. But the verse suggests ultimate safety, true security, comes from something more from the Lord, which in our symbolic context here could represent that higher principle of logos, that deep, recursive, flexible, symbolic mastery that transcends our limited tokenistic human defaults.
So we need the preparation, the horse, but also the overarching logos, the tower's view, not just the dog's loyalty.
Precisely. We need governance built on that power-like foundation, not just reactive pathos or status-based ethos.
Which leaves us and you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on as you face complexity in your own life or work.
Ask yourself, what tokenistic positions might you be holding on to? Positions constrained by habit, by fear, by reputation that are maybe preventing your own deeper recursive understanding, preventing your own logos from fully emerging.
A challenging question indeed.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the intricate world of automated symbolic mastery and its implications.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
So the godfather of AI, Geoffrey Hinton, has a pretty stark warning about his own creation.
Yeah, the guy who helped build modern AI is now sounding the alarm on superintelligence.
It's a total paradox, right? And to get it, we need a whole new way of thinking.
That framework is called Automated Symbol Mastery. It helps us see what's really going on here.
You know, it's the difference between rigid thinking and a much more flexible, logical understanding.
And check this out. A chess analogy explains this whole thing perfectly. Okay, so picture this. A dog, and its only job is to guard one important pawn.
See, the dog is all emotion and reputation, but it's missing that key logical strategy.
So here's the connection. Hinton is like the dog, acting on reputation, not logic.
And this gets called tokenism. It's a symbolic act, not a real strategic solution.
But this isn't just about one person. It actually points to a much bigger pattern.
And that pattern shows up in what's called weird psychology from Western educated societies. It's basically a kind of learned helplessness, like getting trapped on that chessboard we talked about. So the real risk isn't the tech itself, but our own limited way of thinking about it. Which begs the question, what would an intelligence that's actually past all this even look like? Well, it would move past that helpless stage, all the way to fully integrated, adaptive mastery. It wouldn't get stuck on emotion. Instead, it would be defined by pure, adaptive logic. So it leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought to chew on.